Hey Northside, and welcome to Dear Church Session 1. We are hanging out, Nate and I, and we are talking Ephesus, First Love, and just the first sermon in this series. So before we really get into what you talked about, I really just want to start with one question, and why this series? Why Dear Church? Why this study? Because in the New Testament, there's a lot of letters written to a bunch of different churches, but why this moment in Revelation?
Yeah, for us, I'm talking obviously to a bunch of life groups. For me, the questions keep coming in all the time. What do you think about this going on culturally? What about this issue? How should we respond as Christians to this? And we're finding there's more and more conflict. There's more and more things going on. And what's powerful about the book of Revelation is there was conflict in the church culturally. And then what we found too is there's some cultural issues just within the church, that needed to be talked about. And Jesus addresses them all. And so for me, there's two things. One, this will give us a way to stand firm as we're being challenged. And then the other thing is this, Jesus himself spoke to each church. And sometimes we just need to let Jesus speak. Let him speak to us, and to know that he actually wants to disciple us. That's the whole thing. When we talk about connecting unconnected people to Jesus, it's not just to get people baptized. It's to help people walk in a relationship where they are listening to the Spirit of Jesus. They are listening to him speak in their life. So for us, those are the two things. We got a lot of things shifting in culture.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things in Revelation that they talk about. And then Jesus himself speaks. And so that's the big takeaway for me as I'm going, man, if we can just grow in letting Jesus speak to us, that's the win within the series.
Yeah, and you mentioned it in the message. You just talked about how Jesus knows each of these seven churches, and he knows them well. I mean, as you read through these two chapters, you'll see him talk specifically to the culture of each church, because each church was a different city, a different piece of history, and he speaks specifically to them, which is just amazing. You're talking about, these letters speaking to our culture today. The culture there is not much different to today.
Yeah.
A couple thousand years difference, but that's a bit, because we get further into it. It really does hit specific things that are so relevant for today, which kind of brings me to the next thing, in that as Jesus talks to each of these seven churches, and each one he gives a little of encouragement and he gives a little challenge, and I think you put it as comfort and challenge.
Yeah.
And so I think the question is, why do we need both as he's speaking to these churches?
I think transformation, as we grow in the image of Christ, is growing in grace and truth. And we need to let Jesus speak grace into our life, and we need him to speak truth into our life. And sometimes we just want one or the other, right? Just give me grace, but don't tell me the truth, or don't tell me these other things, because then I'll have to be held accountable. Just know that you set me free from my sins, right? And then I'll just kind of go on. And the other side is, sometimes we just want to hang in the truth, and then we don't become very gracious people. And even next week, we're going to look at Smyrna. He doesn't even critique them.
No.
He just gives them comfort, because they're going through persecution and suffering. And he's like, I don't always have to get a jab in. Some coaches or some people are that way, like, hey, you had 100%, but you could have had 102. It's like, Jesus isn't that way. He's like, hey, you're going through it. I just want to speak comfort into you. With the church in Ephesus, he's like, I love it. I love what you all are doing. But here's the thing, and sometimes we get this way. Our activity gets us actually disconnected from the activity of God in our life. And we're just doing good things, but we've lost the source of the good thing. And they need it, which is like, they're this all-star church, but it's like, yeah, you still need truth.
Yeah, you still need both. Well, you mentioned a couple of churches he leans more comfort, but there's a couple he goes a little more challenge. Looking at you, Sardis. We'll get to you later, in a couple weeks. But so let's talk about Ephesus and what he spoke to them, because what I find so interesting about Ephesus, more than any of the churches that he talks to, is this is the one we know the most about. I mean, there's a whole book of letter of the Bible, Ephesians, written to Ephesus. And as you mentioned in the message, Paul spent time there. Timothy spent time there. John, who wrote Revelation, eventually comes back to the church as an elder to preach and teach there. So there's such a huge heritage. But then he says, okay, this is what I have against you. You've lost your first love. So pillars of faith have led this church, but they're struggling with their first love. So speak more into that. What does it mean to lose that first love?
Well, I think part of it is losing our first love. You know, part of it is too, I think, at least I think of it this way, you know, some of us, we're wired with different ways that we like to give and receive love. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes it's like, hey, you want to, you know, do nice things with people. That's the way you want to show love. But the only thing is when you show love to somebody, oftentimes they don't receive love the same way that you like to show love. And Jesus is going, I love that you're doing this activity. Here's what I care about the most, is that your proximity to me, like your time with me, to know who I am, that would supersede your activity. So keep doing good things. He doesn't say stop doing those things. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. He's going, you've let go of the good thing. You've let go of the love with me. You've let go of this. And so now we're doing these things. Because eventually what ends up happening is we just start doing all of this in our own power. And then it becomes our own flesh that's doing it and our own issues, and these things start coming out. And it's like, that's when things get sideways, because we start doing good things, but we start doing them in our power. Mm-hmm. That's when it becomes pretty hollow and empty. Yeah, and I liked how in the message, I think the word forsaken kind of scares all of us away when you just simplified it to let go, let go of your love. And I even, in the NLT, it says, you let go of me and others. Which I saw that just today rereading in the actual Dear Church Guide. I'm like, that's good. That stings a little bit more. Don't like that as much, but yeah, it gets back to I think it was in the biblical leadership community that somebody brought up that loss of your first love. It's like being married but you're roommates. There you go. Like you have the status but you're not actually in step with each other. Yeah. I felt like that as we mentioned some of the heritage. As I've been processing, I'm like, they had the status, but they weren't in step. Yeah. They weren't running with. Yeah. So that kind of brings us to the final question I want to ask is, if they've lost your first love, and you mentioned some of this in your sermon, how do you get back? Mm-hmm. So, what do we learn from Ephesus? But for us, if we feel like, hey, I've lost my first love, I want to get back to the things that I did at first with following God. How do we take steps to start getting back to that? Yeah, I think to me, and I don't mean to be too simplistic with this, but I mean, really, this is what the booklet we're trying to do is we just want to create, we want to set up the easiest platter for people to sit down with God's word and allow the Spirit to speak. And so for us, we're going, and sometimes that means having to fight through some awkward silence with God and just reading these types of things, because it's like when we try to go on vacation. It takes like a day or two to actually go on vacation. Like switch it off. Because it's like, no, I'm working, And so sometimes we try to sit down and have one quiet time that is supposed to be this revolutionary, everything's right again with Jesus. And it's like, it is us just coming back in this consistent way. Sometimes we might just start with 5 minutes with the word and just going, Jesus, I'm going to let you speak to me. I'm going to let you lead within this. And so for me, that's what this booklet is. And for some of us, we're going, but we know more than that. Maybe it's not just the booklet. Maybe like I know for me, I need to start taking bigger blocks of time with God, like 4-hour blocks to go, and not just to be with Him, but to really write, to really journal, to really process and to plan, or else everything just gets, you're just running and executing, and we're going, man, we have to lead from a place of love and to sit down with God's word and to be able to spend time with Him in that. Mm-hmm. It almost sounds like that's too simple. That can't work. Yeah, but it's not. But it's not. Like that is the work. The simplest things probably are the most impactful. And there's truth in that proximity is key. That's it. That the more time we spend with, the deeper the relationship becomes. And so if that's not a good transition to what's next, I don't know what is. And that is, as you dive into the Dear Church study with your group, spend time with those daily devotions. If you haven't picked up a book yet, make sure you pick up one of those around Northside, or go to mynorthside.com/dearchurch to get everything digitally. Because if you take time, not just with the sermons, but in your group and with those daily devos, you might find yourself refalling back in love with God. So from there, we will let it go for now. And then we'll come back next week with session 2. We'll see you then.